So, hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Fátima São Simão, and I will be here presenting talk about copyright and creative work. This session, I hope you can see my screen. Should be working. No. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, if you can follow my presentation. I'm sharing screen, so I don't know why. Sorry for the technical inconvenience, typical from Zoom conferences. Okay, so let's restart. My name is Fátima São Simão. I'm a guest professor at the Faculty of Economics at University of Porto, and I am here to present you talk about copyright and creative work and the not so new emergencies in public policies. So this is the agenda for our talk today, which is a very short presentation about the relations between copyright, creative work, and public policies. So to start with, I'd like to introduce this topic of copyright at the core of new directions of public policies for culture. So we can, I'm so sorry, let me just try to, I don't know what's going on here. Okay, so in terms of cultural policies, something that is important to understand is that over the past decades, they have been mostly economic and market-driven. Culture as a driver of technological innovation, so culture at the service of technological innovation. On the other hand, there are issues such as the arts and humanities being subjected to the creative industries models, and things like the value of culture as, or regarded as, market value of creativity, in other words, regarded as an input. This persistence of innovation-centric policies for the cultural and creative industries, even after the structural fragilities exposed by COVID-19 pandemic crisis, keep compromising cultural work and the very possibilities to innovate. On the other hand, there are other situations that are important to consider at a policy level, and this is the idea that copyright has become a sort of cultural policy. So copyright has become a central feature of the creative industries, as most of us already know, transforming artists into creative entrepreneurs. There's very little consensus in copyright debate, and this lack of consensus has spread into civil society's concerns. And we have seen over the past attempts to reform copyright laws and directives, the emergence of movements and organizations against those very same reforms, which was very much the case of the recent directive on copyright in the digital single market approval and implementation in the EU. So copyright has become a sort of also intrinsic autonomous subject in funded projects, at least in Europe, this has happened. So copyright has had its specific role or its specific topic within funded projects at the EU. And on the other hand, we see international agreements and the global digitization continuously promoting the Western approach to copyright, namely the US model. As Christian Hanke said before, it has become increasingly politicized as the sector is seen as a major source of growth, and here referring to economic growth, of course. So how can we relate, or why is it important to relate copyright and cultural policies? Because copyright has an influence in the value of cultural and creative industries. And we will now look into how this influence happens. So when we think about the value conflicts within the cultural and creative industries, which are a lot, one of the probably most distinguishable characteristics of this sector's activities is the persistent trade-off between cultural, symbolic value and economic or material value, as different authors put it. This conflict is of course the first and the most essential one, but it's not the only conflict that characterizes the cultural and creative markets and cultural and creative work structures and dynamics. There's a few more, and which have been thoroughly researched, and these can be things like market concentration versus proliferation of networks, commercial work versus creative work, conservative work versus more experimental approaches, the dichotomy between income and reward, market uncertainty versus artistic freedom, the star system versus the freelance system, productivity costs or market failure versus profit-led activities, and market-oriented versus cultural diversity. So these are a few of the many conflicts, or the most essential conflicts in the cultural and creative sector that we need to pay attention to when we're talking about things like copyright or anything else that influences these structures and dynamics. So to understand the relation of copyright to these structures and dynamics, we have developed a model that essentially places the author in the center of a series of concentric circles of work roles in the cultural and creative industries. So the author or the artist would be at the center, and these are the essential producers of creativity and of copyrightable works. And as we move forward and outwards in the circles, we will have different layers of agents that act as intermediaries between the original producers of copyrightable works and their audience or consumers or clients, as we want to put it. What is interesting to note here is that the further we move out in the circles, the bigger the bargaining power and the bigger the revenues. And of course, the bigger the capacity to copyright enforcement, which coincides, of course, with financial or political power. So we see that although authors are the essential producers of the copyrightable work, they are very much in the weakest level in terms of bargaining power, revenues, or capacity to enforce their own rights to their work. What is also important to note here is that these roles are very often overlapping or accumulated between the agents. So the same agent can have different roles in these circles. And however, the distance between possible overlapping pairs is bigger as the artist is more famous and powerful, regardless of the quality of their work. For example, star artists are more likely to be distributors than small independent artists. And we can probably observe different forms of job mergers in each creative subsector. So you would have different kinds of job merging in performance or in literature, for example. They will probably not be exactly the same kind of roles and of overlapping of roles in these different subsectors. So this model suggests a dynamic relation between its layers, all interdependent, and when not overlapping, they always relate to one another by the exchange between cultural work and access to finance and or cultural content, both affected by and affecting copyright enforcement capacity. So going back to our idea of how copyright affects or what are the copyright effects in the creative and cultural industry structures and dynamics, we see that the copyright debate is a debate about the value of creativity, because we are talking about this trade-off between cultural value and economic value. So copyright is a mechanism to regulate the probably most distinguishable characteristic of the cultural and creative industries, which, as we have seen, may assume many different forms depending on the type of activities, context, and agents involved. So this is where open licenses come in, and they come in as a possible alternative or future directions or references for policymaking, because open licenses such as Creative Commons offer strategic alternatives to artists and to creative professionals, as they grant authors a certain degree of autonomy towards traditionally powerful intermediary agents, that is, allowing them to recover some bargaining power. They also allow them to embrace opportunities like the paradigm changes, new technologies, or new creative and collaboration practices, or new sustainability models that we heard so much talking about, and also to face challenges such as market concentration, the crescent uncertainty, the regulation in general, but particularly the intellectual property regulations and things like the pandemic crisis that we've come across. So open licenses can represent an interesting model for a copyright reform better suited to both technological evolution and cultural sectors' characteristic, namely its diversity. This is a small example of a work that we have developed at Creative Commons in order to establish this relation and make it easy to understand by authors and artists who wish to use Creative Commons licenses and as an instrument, as a strategic instrument to overcome some of the big difficulties they have in pursuing their career paths or their professional works. Some final remarks in terms of public cultural policies for the digital era concerning copyright, the relation to copyright. One of the things that is important to highlight with this model is that it needs yet to be tested empirically. It has not yet been tested empirically, and this is a step that it needs to go. Then we also recommend further research using some imagination, and imagination here on purpose, to deeply understand artists' work, namely their intrinsic management practices, which are often undervalued in relation to traditional firm management. There are some projects that have been developed about this. We have come across one last year, but there's a lot to be done that should actually go out of the common silos of academic research, because copyright is much more than an economic affair. It not only affects cultural and creative market structures and dynamics, it affects the way in which we access knowledge to perceive ourselves and the world. And this continuous divorce between cultural policies and copyright policies should be corrected as soon as possible. The progressive diversity of cultural works, agents, activities, and contexts due to digital technologies reinforces the lack of consensus, as copyright regulation tends to push towards one-size-fits-all solution, defending mostly major markets and corporate interests, instead of looking to solutions already successfully tested, as the already mentioned Creative Commons licenses, for example. We also need to rethink and redebate the role and value of the artist in the digital society, and to develop cultural policies as an umbrella capable of accommodating diversity of contexts, activities, agents, and works, while limiting possible pervasive implementation effects. And this should be the role of cultural policy, and copyright should absolutely be aligned with this goal. I leave you here some references, bibliographic references from the work that we have been developing about this topic. And these are my contacts. Feel free to reach me or to put your questions through email, since we don't have any room for questions here today. Thank you very much. I hope the technical confusion in the beginning did not mess too much our session. So thank you very much.